Hello. Hello, everyone. Hello. Hi. Thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see this room crowded with people coming to talk about climate change. So thanks a lot for joining the session, which is on the investigative agenda for climate change, and we're looking at fossil fuels in particular. I'm not sure we're up there, but I'm Ann Koch, and I'm the program director.
There she is.
Oh, there she is. Yes, we're joined also. Hello, Sita, but we'll explain in a moment. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Ann Koch. I'm the program director at the Global Investigative Journalism Network. For those who don't know what it is, we are the largest training and support network for investigative journalists. Today I'm joined by but four speakers, as you just saw a moment ago. And I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves in a moment. I just wanted to give you a bit of background to the whole investigative agenda on climate change. About 6 months ago, GIJN convened a meeting, and we invited about 80 journalists and experts and nonprofits as well, all people working on climate change, all people investigating, to talk about what the priorities should be for investigation in this area of climate change. Obviously, climate change is an incredibly important issue. It needs journalists, all kinds of journalists working on it. But we were focusing on the climate, on the investigative agenda. And we came up with quite an interesting list of topics to investigate. We're not going to try and talk about all of those today. If you're interested in reading about it, we have a report on our website. And all of the people represented at this meeting today, all of the people at the meeting today, rather, were represented at that meeting, and 3 of them in person, and Guardian was there as well, where Ajit works. So we're coming together again to talk about the one aspect of that, which is fossil fuels, which I think people in this room would understand. I think you understand why fossil fuels would be an investigative priority for journalists working on climate change. So just by way of introduction, I just wanted to start by talking about really a central contradiction that it sums up in the most simple way what the problem that we have, which is that on the one hand, never has the world needed a scientifically based process for getting rid of, stopping to use fossil fuels. Never has it been more needed. And at the same time, never have the fossil fuel industry been trying to either slow down or stop that effort. And that's kind of at the nub of the contradiction. I mean, it's a very simplistic, but quite, I think, effective way of describing some of the issues. Now, of course, they wouldn't want to blow up their business plans. That's how they make money. And we rely on those fossil fuels. It's a complex issue. But at the heart of it is that issue, really, that contradiction. And just to conclude, I want to say, again, I'll just say that I think a lot of journalism is needed on climate change, but the investigation is what we're going to talk about today, and I think most of you know that really is in journalism that tries to call companies, governments, institutions to account. That's the focus. There's a lot of other climate journalism that needs to be done, but that is the kind of focus for today. So without further ado, I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves, starting with you, Amy.
Okay. I'm Amy Westerveld. I'm an investigative climate reporter. I was a print reporter for a long time. Then I started an audio project called Drilled, which does a podcast, a true crime podcast about climate change. Now we're doing print stuff too, and we co-publish with The Guardian and lots of other places.
Hey, sorry, is that okay? Yeah, I'm Ajit Naranjan. I'm an environment correspondent at The Guardian, covering basically all of Europe, but not the UK, thankfully, which as a British person I'm allowed to say that.
We're not in Europe anymore,
no, exactly.
So it's fine.
We're out. And yeah, before that I used to be at Deutsche Welle, the German international public broadcaster, where I think quite a lot of what we were doing was trying to convey what the scientists knew very simply and clearly, and spanning the full spectrum of TikToks to kind of in-depth YouTube documentaries.
Hi everyone, my name is Andrés Bermúdez Líbano. I'm a Colombian journalist and I work at the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism, where we promote cross-border collaborative investigations in the region. And my reporting has been on the carbon credit offsetting world, which is basically part of the wider fossil fuel ecosystem, because it's basically one of the ways the fossil fuel industry resorts to to green their reputation.
Sunita, can you introduce yourself from India?
Yes. Yes, of course. Firstly, let me apologize to all the colleagues in the room that I'm not there with you. Actually, I'm not there because of the flood in Dubai. And so climate change has a reason why I'm not there with you. My flight was delayed out of India. So I'm Sunita Narayan. I'm the editor of Down to Earth. Down to Earth is a fortnightly news magazine on science, environment. I'm also an environmentalist, researcher, and I work at the Center for Science and Environment. So dual roles.
Great, thank you. And I would add that Sunita's been doing climate work for 30 plus years. So
Yes.
she's right there, been following for many years. So we thought we would start by setting the stage, so to speak, and just laying out some kind of main facts or context a little bit to the discussion that we'll have on the actual investigation. And I wanted to offer a few myself. And this just really sets the stage to what we're talking about. So first of all, as everyone in this room knows, greenhouse gases are rising inexorably, and fossil fuels, and we're talking obviously about oil, well maybe not obviously, but oil, gas, and coal by and large. And they account for 70% of global greenhouse gases caused by human beings. So the fossil fuel industry is responsible for 70%. The second sort of contextual point is that despite the climate crisis, fossil fuel producers are increasing production. This is a generalization, not everywhere, but globally, fossil fuel production is increasing, even though governments and companies have made net zero commitments and other climate change mitigation promises or pledges. And finally, it's kind of saying the same thing in another way. My third factoid, if you like, is that a recent International Energy Agency report said there would be no room for oil and gas exploration projects if global warming was to be limited to internationally agreed limits. I think you've kind of heard the same thing from me now 4 times. So I want to turn to you, Abby.
Okay.
Yeah, and you.
More context.
Yeah, more context,
all right, well, 2 things. One, the Carbon Majors report was just updated last week, and it's now 57 companies that make up the Carbon Majors, which is a pretty small number of companies contributing the largest share of emissions. And they have been increasing emissions since the Paris Climate Accord was signed. So we're going the opposite direction. And another interesting aspect of that report is just that we're seeing that increase much more sharply with state-owned oil companies versus investor-owned. So this is something we'll get into in this conversation, but it's very hard to investigate state-owned oil companies, but we need to figure out a way to do it because increasingly they're becoming, the lion's share of this problem.
Could you give a couple of examples like state oil?
Saudi Aramco, ADNOC, Equinor, let's throw them in the mix. So there's that. And then the other thing I'll say is that, we have pretty good data on the fact that these companies are investing as much or more in influence peddling and shaping policies in their favor as they are in anything to do with anything that's not hydrocarbon focused. So, and I would include a lot of the carbon capture stuff in that as well, because about 80% of captured carbon gets used to actually get more oil out of the ground. So how that became a climate solution is a mystery.
Yeah, we're going to, Amy will get a bit more into that in a moment. We'll talk a bit more in detail about that. Please.
Yeah, and maybe just add to that, that point you made about the spending on influence. The total, so the total spending on clean energy from the global oil and gas industry is about 2.5% of their capital goes towards these renewable clean projects. I think that does also include carbon capture projects. The International Energy Agency expects by 2030 that should be about 50% if we want to stay on track for 1.5. So I mean, there's so many, as you said, Anne, there's so many different ways that you can draw out that hypocrisy between what's kind of stated and what's being done. But even if you just go back a few years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has already been very clear that the amount of fossil fuel infrastructure we already have, unabated, so not including carbon capture, is more than enough to blow through the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what world leaders have said they're aspiring to, well, they're promised to get to. Yeah.
Sure. Shall I go to Sita next? Sita, do you want to jump in here? You weren't really primed for this.
I can, Anne.
Please.
I mean, I totally agree with everything that you, Amy, and Ajit have said. I just want to add to this entire issue another complexity, which makes it very important for us to both understand and should influence the way we write and we investigate further. The issue about who really uses fossil fuel and who needs the fossil fuel. When you talk fossil fuel, we need to also put on it a very human face, the face of a poor woman who needs energy and still is dependent on very dirty fuel, which is biomass, and which really damages her lungs and damages her body. And she has no choice because she has no money to get clean energy today. And that image needs to be in our heads because quite often, and I believe this is where this conversation is so important, and I'm really sorry I'm not there in person, because we must have this conversation so that we don't let the fossil fuel industry divide us further. The fact is, there is another hypocrisy that we need to call out. The hypocrisy between the North and the South. The hypocrisy when coal is called out and often gas is not called out. When we are told that we need to move to clean energy, and yet we know that when the horrible war started with Ukraine, Europe went and drilled and justified all its investment in new LNG stations, and the US justified being the world's largest producer of oil and gas today in the name of helping its allies. I mean, that's the hypocrisy that we need to call out, because otherwise it divides us. It divides us and does not allow us to talk in one voice about the need for us to address fossil fuels and the industry of fossil fuel and to be able to find alternatives. So I just wanted to bring this other perspective in, which is something from our part of the world.
Very appreciated. Thank you for that, Andres.
And to add to what everyone has said, I would say that the one thing that helps explain why the fossil fuel industry can continue growing is that they can cancel off those emissions that Amy and Anne were just describing. And they can do so with something called carbon offsetting that we'll go into more detail in a minute. But just to show you the size that this other sort of like related industry has taken, fossil fuel and together with car manufacturers account for 75% of the offsetting by the top 50 world companies. So they're basically the prime buyers of these carbon credits. The company that has bought the most carbon credits in the world in the past 2020 to 2022, this covers, was Shell, with more than 10 million carbon credits, which means basically they offset the equivalent of 10 million tons of CO2 that they produced buying these pieces of paper. And Chevron was number 3 with 6.something million, 6.4 I think it was. So they're resorting to this other industry to basically sort of like lower down the net emissions that they're in, that their production.
On paper.
That's what I mean,
Not
on
in
paper.
the atmosphere.
On paper.
Yeah.
With these little pieces of paper.
When I was talking to you, you had a really good comparison. You had a good comparison to explain this. Can you, involving a pop singer?
I was going to save her for a minute, but I don't know if any of you know
I jumped the gun,
all of
sorry.
this. Yes, but I don't know if you know that Taylor Swift, you probably know she has a private plane. You maybe know that she's net zero. She doesn't have any emissions. She flew from Tokyo to Las Vegas to the Super Bowl to watch, her boyfriend win the Super Bowl, but she didn't, she's zero emissions. And the reason is she buys carbon credits. So it's, it's like she didn't fly, but of course she did fly. And the fossil fuel is doing this on a, much larger scale, of course.
Yes, thank you for that. That's really good. So let's, I still don't understand how anyone can think this was a solution, but maybe one of you can explain that to me. Let's talk about investigation a little bit. And digging deep. It's a big field. It's, as you can hear, it's almost like an ecosystem of influence of multiple companies, not just the fossil fuel companies, but millions of businesses rely on them and so on. This is a big area. So how to, and it's been, journalists have been investigating for some time. Yeah. Really decades, actually, almost. So that raises some questions, but certainly one of them is, what is the best area to focus on? Why do you decide to work on what you're doing? And what do you focus on and why? Yeah. This is, I'm gonna just stick to the order that we're sitting in. Sorry, and people, please jump in. Yeah.
Okay. I mostly focus on what I call like the enablers ecosystem, and also this issue of I call it information pollution because it's not really quite disinformation. It's like the creation of misleading information, and there's a huge industry around it. It's not just the fossil fuel companies, it's the PR companies, the management consultancies, the law firms, the lobbyists, the front groups, the think tanks. There's so many. I would include universities in that, actually, at this point. There's several university research centers that, are not just getting money to research things like carbon capture and hydrogen, which I would argue is, pointing a lot of quote-unquote solutions, thinking in the direction of the industry's preferred solutions, but also research into public policy, economics, all these things that underpin what governments end up doing. So I don't know, I think about it as like kind of starting with the information that they're using to justify all of these blockers to policy and like very warped policy suggestions, and there's a ton of space to look into that.
Could you talk about something specific that
Yes.
you've done that can bring?
Yeah, I'll talk about like that. There's a story I'm working on right now, and it actually ties into what Sunita was saying about LNG too. That as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, I mean, the API, the American Petroleum Institute, was like ready with its wish list of
This is
policies.
the biggest lobbying group in the United States for the oil and
for
gas
oil and
industry.
gas. Yeah, so they started lobbying immediately. Within a month, had this amazing deal on the table between the U.S. and the EU that was locking in gas for at least the next decade, at least. And then almost immediately after that, various front groups started up to start lobbying not just US politicians, but EU politicians as well, to extend those contracts, extend that deadline, and lock in more gas. So one of the front groups we've been looking at is called the PAGE Coalition. It's a bunch of North American LNG producers. PAGE stands for Partnership to Address Global Emissions. Sounds like an environmental group. It's not. Their big selling point is that LNG is a climate solution. And the way they make that argument is by claiming that all LNG is displacing coal, which we know it's not. For the most part, it's just replacing other gas. And also, the more we learn about methane and even some of the CO2 emissions associated with refining and transporting LNG, the more that picture is really shifting in terms of whether it's actually better than coal, even if it is displacing coal. So there's a lot of questions on that. However, they have a report that they've been pushing to European politicians about unleashing American gas as the top climate solution. And that report, we looked at just the metadata of the PDF and saw that, okay, this is a guy who doesn't work for this coalition or any of these companies. Who is this? Oh, he's an oil and gas guy at McKinsey. So we contacted McKinsey and the coalition and the company and everything. And they're like, oh, well, you know, McKinsey didn't write the report, but they did do the data and analysis. And like, did the company and the coalition ask for particular data and analysis? Yes. So this is like this very interesting way that all of these consultancies and sort of even kind of industry and economic consultants get used to produce models that seem somewhat objective, but are actually just crafted to do lobbying. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask you one follow-up, which is that you really major, if you like, on this, partly because the industry itself is really hard to investigate.
Yeah.
And so this is a tip, like a strategy.
Yes.
So can you talk a bit more about your work, the kind of work you just described, as an example of a strategy of looking at all the influencers around and why you do that? I mean, they're important, but also it's easier in a way to do journalism, isn't it? I mean,
totally.
Easier.
Yeah, it's so
somewhat
easy.
easier.
No, no, it's a lot easier to get whistleblowers at like a PR agency than at ExxonMobil. Same with McKinsey. Like most of the people that are working for the vast majority of these entities did not think that they were starting out their job or their career to like carry water for a fossil fuel industry or a fossil fuel company that wanted to lie about climate change. So like, you know, it's a lot easier to get information and documents from those people than it is from like a high-level executive at an oil major. Hot tip.
That was the first hot tip of the session. Imagine.
Yeah, maybe I can just go for the other side of the picture. Like, there is so much to be found within these companies that mostly doesn't get looked at.
Yeah, this is a very important point.
And I would say maybe the flip side of it, which The Guardian does quite well, I think, is kind of the public-facing things that, like, once you know the science, and even those basic facts that we kind of just listed at the beginning, then there's so much hypocrisy to be found between what companies are saying and what they're actually doing. And that, I mean, to give an example from my colleague Damien, I think during the COP, the most recent climate summit, I think he watched a series of panels and events that the president, Al Jaber, did, and found one where he just very casually said that there's no science behind a fossil fuel phase-out.
Right.
And that became the big story during the summit. So, I mean, I'm quite curious. I wonder if there are fossil fuel lobbyists watching this now and seeing what your favorite techniques are. But I think one useful thing that I could say is we should maybe be a bit careful about how narrowly we define the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
Because you've got the suppliers who are producing, like drilling down for oil and digging up coal. But they can make a fairly credible argument. I mean, I wonder if you're going to disagree with me on this one. But
Let's go. I'm just
that,
kidding.
that if they don't dig it up, then somebody else will.
Yeah.
And of course, that doesn't justify any of the lobbying or the huge amounts of money pouring into changing government policy. But there is a fair point in that, which is that the demand from all the other companies, the airlines, the car companies, if all of these different actors aren't also transitioning, then this problem isn't getting solved.
Yeah.
And so I think, maybe one, if there is a tip to be given here, is that there's a lot of journalists working on what Shell and Exxon and all of these guys are doing. I don't think there's really much interest in what, I don't know, Ryanair, exactly, yeah. Or like the cement and steel makers who get zero public pressure.
Yeah.
So I guess actually just a quick question for the audience. How many people here are actually climate beat reporters? Like how many people here, just a quick show of hands? Oh, okay, that's actually more than I was expecting. And how many people are not?
About 50-50 maybe.
If in any of your countries or your regions or within your beat, whether you're covering fashion or, I don't know, travel, tourism, there's a huge amount to be found from companies that regular climate reporters, I guess, are not really looking into because we either don't have time or don't have the connections. That would be my tip.
Great, I'm going to go to you now. No, I'll go to you first, Andrea, and then I'll go to Sunita. Yeah,
Okay.
please, just.
So we have also started thinking about like the wider influence of the fossil fuel industry, like Amy was saying, the enablers, and sort of you can take that one circle further ahead. And as I was saying earlier, one of the things that the industry, has been doing to continue thriving and doing business as usual is this thing called offsetting that I described with the Taylor Swift example. And basically, it's linked to carbon credits, which are basically these pieces of paper that, in a nutshell, in one of its most common forms, basically links local communities that care for forests that are, or ecosystems that are strategic to mitigate climate change with companies that want to, lower their carbon footprint. And by buying the environmental results that the others have been, doing, they are able to lower the numbers of their emissions. And this to the point that this is the cornerstone of many of these oil companies' plans and blueprints for reaching net zero, which will obviously continue allowing them to grow. Instead of
Can I just interrupt you
reducing,
for a minute?
Yeah.
Can I just check in the audience, does everyone know what carbon offsetting is? Please don't, does anyone not understand what it is? Okay. No.
And
Because there's a
so-
lot of jargon, and
Yeah.
wanted to, it's one of the things I think that puts off the public, our audiences, so just checking here. Sorry, keep
Thanks.
going.
To the point that Amy was making, so instead of reducing their actual carbon footprint of their actual production and their supply and value chains, what they do is they pay to use other people's environmental results. But the problem, and it sounds like a win-win so far from the point of view that, for example, we need funds to get, to arrive to local communities in countries like mine, in the Amazon basin, in Central Africa, in Southeast Asia, but increasingly now in other ecosystems like, mangroves and wetlands, to be able to preserve some of these ecosystems that we really need, either because they're carbon sinks or because they, of course, help us, regulate climate, etc. But oftentimes this solution is not working like it was intended, and the devil usually is in the details, but we found that a lot of them are not working properly. And just to give you, one example, we found a project on the border Colombian border with Ecuador, so a very remote area, very high altitude ecosystem called a páramo, a moor, but it's a very strange ecosystem because it's in the tropics above 4,000 meters high. And it's basically it's a very important ecosystem in our Andean countries. And it's an indigenous community where 99% of the community had no idea that they were part of a carbon credit project that had not only been designed, but it was already active, and it had already sold 100,000 credits to Chevron,
Wow.
which is one of the biggest oil companies in the world.
Did you say this was Ecuador?
Sorry?
Ecuador?
No, it's Colombia, but
On the
right
border.
across the border, like very remote area. And that wasn't the only thing that was going on wrong. Nobody in the community had been consulted. Of course, they had no access to the project documents. Of course, there was no accountability on where the money had gone, what they'd done with it, because half of the money, or 60% of the revenue, supposedly, should go to the community. They had signed a contract with the local governor, but, the guy, never told anyone about it.
Wow.
They've litigated it. They've won a court case, and even though they've won in court, nothing has really changed. But we even found a gigantic conflict of interest. The businesswoman, Mexican, for some reason I still can't explain, but the Mexican businesswoman running the project hired her former business partners, actually her former company, to audit her project. So, independently, of course.
Amazing.
It was an independent audit that said the project was perfect.
Sorry, how much money was involved? Do you know?
Nobody knows because they're not obliged to disclose this. And of course, the community knows nothing about, not even where $1 has gone. And my point is, this is as much a story about an environmental solution gone wrong, about a local community being, sort of perhaps cheated. It's not very clear, but out of what corresponds them. But it's also a story about an oil company. It's also a story about a fossil fuel, how the fossil fuel industry has found a way to cancel out these emissions that will allow them to continue working as usual, but in projects that are not really even having an environmental, they have no environmental integrity. They're actually not doing what they're meant to do. And so my point at the end of the day of all of this is that to look, we should be looking at their wider influence, to understand how and why they're still thriving in terms of business. And this is one reason, because they can actually, sort of, greenwash
Get away with
their
it,
way.
yeah.
Yes.
Can I just add one
Please.
tiny thing on carbon offsets too? The other thing to think about is that it's only really offsetting anything if like those trees were going to be cut down
Correct.
otherwise, which they weren't, so like it's kind of a false premise from jump. Very small percentage of carbon offset programs are actually like holding back emissions that otherwise would have been released. So yeah.
And when you look at the majority, a lot of these projects, who has bought the credits, you find on and on, it's oil producing companies,
Yeah.
gasoline distributors. It's like the whole, array of companies that conform the fossil fuel industry. And they're in part, I think, thriving because, they're allowed to claim these non-existent environmental results.
Yeah.
Sunita, can you hear us?
I keep going, where is
Yes,
Yeah,
I
there she is.
can.
Yeah.
And
Now she does.
fascinating. So we also did a very, very detailed investigation into carbon credits as they're working in India or not working in India. And pretty much the same stories as my friend from is describing from Colombia, I think you said.
Yes.
I think it's a very important story of our times to do, but I think it's also important to note how difficult it is to do it. And that's where the scale of investigation has to come in. When we started working on this, what appalled me is just the sheer lack of information. The global players in this, whether it is Vera or Gold Standard, they're the two sort of, the two global supranational agencies which are supposed to validate and these projects. They don't put the data out in any way that is usable or transparent. The companies don't put the data out. The rules are made so that the entire business is done so that the auditors, the verifiers, the consultants, and all the partners that you just spoke about, they are the ones who make money on these projects. And the worst is that they are leading to overcrediting. In our case, whether it is a cook stove project, cook stove, very important. I spoke about why women in our part of the world are still using dirty biomass, cooking food on very, very inefficient cook stoves. So wonderful if you can get a carbon credits project which supplies clean cook stoves to women. But actually it does not. Actually what it's doing is to overcredit the amount of emissions that are saved, and those cook stoves do not work. So I do not understand how these global agencies and all their verifiers and validators and auditors are going out there in the field and giving a clean chit to these companies. And in India as well, Shell, Michelin, all the top companies have bought carbon credits, whether it is on planting trees on poor people's homes, for which they do not get any money other than a free sapling, or it is about so-called providing a biogas plant in which the state government, the poor state governments in India are actually investing money, and the credit is being taken by the rich consumers. So in a sense, the irony of the world today is that the poor are subsidizing the rich, including Taylor
Swift.
Taylor Swift, including Taylor Swift.
We don't mean to take...
to fly around and to take credit. So I think that is a very important story, and our report was called Discredited, quite rightly so, and created quite a fuss because it was an investigation both from ground up, but also looking at these companies and what they're doing. Unfortunately, there's a huge cleanup operation currently underway to clean up these companies so that they can be business as usual going on. But I think that's one part of the investigative journalist's story on fossil fuel and climate. I think the larger part for us in our world is really holding governments to account for inaction. And that's not just in India, but for holding governments to account all over the world. Because the question of climate justice means that we need to be able to understand, as I said at the beginning, who needs the fossil fuels, if at all, and who does not. And there are some hard questions there that need to be answered. That does Africa have the right to use its fossil fuels, or does Europe have the right to take its fossil fuels? And those are some of the investigative issues that need to be discussed and need to be explored. And finally, I think the biggest issue to me is a finance issue, which gets linked to fossil fuel, both in terms of fossil fuels and the alternatives. And this also links to the huge tragedies that we are seeing in our world because of the impacts of climate change. Yeah. And that's where the question about what's the nature of finance? Is this finance which is coming as grant, concessional, or is it finance which is actually adding to the burden of debt in countries to make the transition? And that's a very important part, because if we want countries to move out of fossil fuels to cleaner, greener alternatives, we need to be able to understand also how the finance works and how it does not work. And it's certainly not working today, and making countries, poor countries, even more crippled, on one hand because of the impacts of climate change, and on the other hand, because of the way finance is being delivered to them, both in terms of the green transition as well as in terms of adaptation finance.
Gosh, Sunita, you've just given the whole, we have so many jobs to do, don't we? It's the whole agenda, but that's wonderful. Before you get off that, could you describe a little bit? Because I think the story about how you did that investigation, going around very practically, village to, I think it's just really, would be of interest here. And how you developed the methodology for investigation in the context that you were working. I think if you could share that with us, it would be really interesting.
Thank you, Anne. So 2 things. I think there's no rocket science in this. We're all journalists and we all know what investigation means. And essentially, when we got to this story, as many of these stories are, it seemed very simple, that you had these global registries. We would know which are the projects in India. We would then send, our reporters, correspondents, would go down to the villages and look at it and report from it. And we thought that would be the story. But frankly, we were blocked at all ends. So the first thing was to try and understand where and what are the projects. And for that, we had to really do a detailed deep dive into the websites of the global registries. And that data is not available easily because it's disaggregated. So making a complete database on the name of the project, when was it sanctioned, how many carbon credits given, what location was it, essentially preparing a database which, when we put it out, the Indian government said, we'd never seen this. We'd never known of the scale of the number of projects that were operating even in India, because that just was not visible till that data was put out. So first was putting together the data. Then, of course, selecting very carefully which were the companies which had the maximum impact and places that we could visit. And again, we were blocked. One of the companies, which is the top carbon credits company in India called EKI, wrote to us that we could not visit their projects. And this is India. And, we could not visit the projects and they could not talk to us because they were in a period of silence. I don't know, Indians do go into periods of silence, and we love our yogic trances, but for a company to send us an email that said, we cannot talk to you because we are in a period of silence. A French company called Livelihood Fund actually wrote back to us saying, with the temerity to write back to us to say that we could not visit their project sites, which were in a part of India, South India, because that was very dangerous, and that there was bad roads, bad connectivity, and that, it was very dangerous because it was insurgency over there. I mean, you're telling an Indian journalist that they can't visit an Indian village because of the following reasons. So it was block, 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 block. And then, of course, as all investigative journalists, I think the one fundamental rule is that you are a dog with a bone, that you don't let go, and that you keep at it. And I love Amy's podcast name. You keep drilling down and drilling down and drilling down. And that's what you do as you put the story together. And it was a fascinating story of just the amount of subterfuge, the amount of fraud, what I call creative carbon accounting happening, and the fact that these companies were getting away with it and being lauded and feted all over the world as providing carbon credits so that Taylor Swift could fly.
I love it. I mean, one of the things Sunita did was she brought up that it's such a big agenda because, of course, we also haven't had a chance at all today, really, and because I want to leave some time for questions. But of the role of government. Companies obviously are there to make money. They're there to make profit, and governments are there, perhaps, to maybe regulate them. So obviously government accountability is essential. And the other area that we looked at in our discussions about priorities was the money. One of the tropes of investigative journalism is follow the money. There's no exception in this area either. Follow the money. The money is incredibly complicated. Think about what we just heard, and then think of funding behind it, and think of how to find it, think of how to track it. Really, really challenging stuff. So I would like to leave time for questions, but I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make some closing comments, things they haven't had a chance to say. There's so many questions, sorry, also about audiences, the public, communication, how we get this stuff across. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. But that's an essential issue in the age of disinformation. Climate's a huge one. It's an area, it's along with wars and whatever, it is one of the key areas for disinformation and misinformation. Yeah, so I'm sorry, we just touched on things. It's only 15 minutes, so forgive me, but I'll let you have the last word, each of you, please.
I'll just quickly say, well, two things. Have you looked at Taylor Swift's methane emissions?
No.
I'm sorry. I can't help it. I'm a 15-year-old boy. No, actually, the thing I was going to say is that there's often very little light between the government and the fossil fuel industry, and that includes in the US and throughout the EU and the UK and all of these places. So I do feel like even just getting the calendars of representatives is quite handy in tracking down what exactly they're doing and how many more fossil fuel lobbyists they're meeting with than anybody else and all of that kind of thing.
Thank you.
I would maybe just quickly say that I hope we haven't made it sound like this is complex in any way. There is a certain amount of science to learn and get your head around, but ultimately everyone can do this and should ideally be doing it more and more and more and more. And yeah, maybe that the best place to start is really in your home country with the companies that you aren't seeing getting covered.
And I would add that since some of these subject matters indeed are complex, but they have steep learning curves, but we can shorten them by collaborating. I would say we need to continue radically collaborating amongst ourselves, because for example, I can do the project back home that's wrong, but Chevron doesn't talk to me, but maybe they answer Amy. So we need to collaborate amongst ourselves, but there's also a lot of specialized organizations that are very, very willing to get to help you understand some of these, whether it's net zero targets or how the carbon market works. There's very specialized NGOs. And also whistleblowers in many of these outlying areas, as Amy was saying, like perhaps not in the middle of the companies, but in all of these outlying areas, there's people who are very, very frustrated with the way things are working, and they're more than willing to, take the risk to help you out.
And even if they won't
get
give
the
you
story out.
documents or a quote, like they can give you background and point you to where the bodies are buried, which is like very, very helpful.
And then help you understand if you're interpreting things correctly. Yeah.
Okay, Sunita, just 30 seconds from you, if you wouldn't mind. I'm sorry, we're running out of time.
No, not at all. And just to say, for me, the politics perspective's equally important. So more conversations between us to understand each other is very critical.
Absolutely true. Thank you. Now, we have time for a couple of questions. In the front? Is there a microphone or? Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, you've given it to somebody else. Can you be second then? No, please start, and just to save time. Thank you.
Hi. Again. I'm already
You again.
I would like to ask a different question, which is asked yesterday.
Okay.
But it's a bit similar, related with the COP29 in Azerbaijan. I'm an Azerbaijan exile-based journalist and activist. And the question is for investigative journalist community. It's super difficult to investigate state oil company of Azerbaijan, which is former employee, now the chairman of the COP29, Mukhtar Babayev. But it's also difficult sometimes investigate like Western oil companies, state oil companies like Equinor, former Statoil. When a few months ago, Statoil, Equinor sold their part to SOCAR, it's approximately, deal is happening between $1 billion, but they didn't announce exactly for how much they sold this package to Azerbaijan state oil company. And we asked like Norwegian colleagues, even Norwegian diplomats, journalists, guys, could you help us to investigate this deal? Because we believe this big corruptions happened between them. So if you know, this is difficult to ask Statoil, because it's state inside the state in Norway. And could you imagine our situation, how we can investigate companies like SOCAR? And question is related with investigative journalists. Some investigative journalists, which is recently attended to Global Investigative Journalism Conference, which is happening in Sweden, when they return back right after your conference, they are arrested because they're exposed to fossil oil companies like SOCAR. It's like two young journalists which is attended to your conference. How is the investigative journalist community able to help them? How to possible to expose these like-minded state leaders, which is, for example, President Biden recently appointed Mr. Podesta, Tony Podesta, which is former oil company lobbyist, and he's received lots of money from Azerbaijan. Now he's special envoy on behalf of the US president. How is it possible with this kind of leaders, and why nobody asking, like Mr. Biden, for you are appointed guy which has worked for Egyptian government, for Azerbaijani government, and for
I think you're asking a question of how to investigate kind of darker figures or
yes,
less transparency within
related
the
with
industry.
the COP29 as well.
Yeah, thank you for the question. On the conference question, come and talk to me afterwards. But on the investigation question, yeah, do you want to have a go at it? Either of you two? Yeah, both of you?
I do think that the collaboration thing should hopefully help. And then actually no more.
Oh,
okay.
Please finish. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, collaborating with journalists in other places and also going to some of these specialized research things. Like I know someone in Norway that can help you. So
that's how, the collaboration thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're running really out of time, but I just want to take one more, please. Just one.
Okay, I'll be super quick.
Yeah, last one.
How journalism actually drives change. That's my role, is all about that. This issue just feels so overwhelming. Just said amazing journalism over 20, 30 years. Like, you're exposing so much. So many people are aware. All of these things are happening, yet emissions increase, like the production is increasing.
Yeah.
How do we actually change the behavior of these huge 57 companies, especially the state-owned ones? Like, ultimately, it's very simplistic, but how and what role does journalism play in that? Because it feels like
just that's a super quick question.
Yeah, this is a question for people. For people at the back, and then we have to end. This is a question about impact. Lots and lots of journalism. Why aren't things changing fast enough? it's a very important question, but yeah, we have to hurry with the answer, sorry.
I mean, things are definitely changing. I think you can, like, it's very easy to look at the situation now and say, okay, well, emissions are still rising, things are still on track for horrible temperatures. We obviously don't know what they would have been like had we not made all of those changes.
Actually, no, we do know.
We do.
Yeah, it's been getting downgraded. So, I mean, 5 degrees to 3 degrees is still bad, still very bad, not enough. But, like, that is actually a massive improvement from where it would have been. And, like, yeah, sorry.
No, and just that a lot of that happened in a way that is almost hard to believe now. Like, I mean, I only started covering climate 5 years ago, and that was at a point where renewable energy was already pretty cost competitive with fossil fuels. The idea of being born into a world where
Experience Umbria through the European Union's
Thank you. Thank you, Sunita. Thank you to the panelists. Thank